People think that when a woman is finally set free, the first thing she does must be something large. They imagine she throws the door open and runs. I am 83 years old, and the first thing I did was so small you would have missed it if you stood in the room. I buried my husband in the autumn of 2022. Eli was a minister in our Gmai, a Diener zum Buch, ordained by the lot, a preacher for 50 years. For 60 years, my mornings had not been my own. They belonged to him and to the farm and to the church and to the Ordnung that told a plain woman what her hands were for before the sun was up. I want to tell you what I did with the first morning that belonged to no one but me. But you have to understand the 60 that came before it, because the size of what I did only makes sense against their weight. The thing itself took less than a minute. The permission took my whole life. So I am going to ask you to stay in this room with me, the way you would sit with an old woman who has finally been given leave to speak. If you have ever lived inside a house where your mornings were written for you before you woke, add your voice in the quiet below, so the next woman who finds this knows she was not the only one. Tell me where you are sitting tonight and whether you have a morning of your own. I kept a black composition notebook, its cardboard cover gone soft at the corners, with a pencil I sharpened with a paring knife. I wrapped it in a square of oilcloth so the damp of the woodshed would not get to it, and hid it in a wooden crate behind the harness Eli always meant to mend and never did. I wrote in it by lamplight, after he had gone up to bed, for nearly 40 years. Nobody ever saw a word of it. I want you to hold that, not as a secret kept against a man, but as a woman keeping the one room in the house that was hers. The mornings were the spine of it. A plain woman's day begins in the dark, and it begins for other people. I would feel the cold of the floorboards before anything else, and already be counting: the lamp to be lit, the cook stove to be fed, the coffee, the men, the children, the day laid out like a row of chores, waiting since the night before to take me. I do not remember choosing to rise. I rose the way water remembers running downhill. 60 years, and I could not name a single morning that began with a thought of my own, because there was never a gap between the dark and the chore wide enough for one to fit in. I was 18 when I married Eli and moved to his family's home farm, 20 steps from his mother's dowdy house. The only counsel my mother gave me the morning of my hochzeit was to be yielding. She said it the way she might have said to mind the frost on the squash, not as comfort, as instruction. And I learned what it meant fast, because Lydia, Eli's mother, took me every Sunday across those 20 steps to be formed into a proper wife. After Gideon was born, and then Lavina, and the 3 that came after, the dark filled up with small bodies that needed me, and that too was a kind of mercy, because a woman who is needed every minute does not have one left to ask whether she wanted any of it. It was never an accident. A full life and an owned life look exactly the same from the outside. The trick is to keep her too busy to feel the difference. There was a thing the Ordnung did to time that I have never heard anyone name. It took the future away from you. From the time you were a small braves maidel in a one-room school, it taught you that you were not to plan. To plan was a kind of pride, Hochmut, the chief sin, the trapdoor under every woman's feet. A good plain woman does not imagine where she will be in 10 years, because that has already been decided, and to imagine otherwise is to set yourself above God's will. So you learn to make your whole self the size of the task, and never 1 inch larger, because the inch that hangs over the edge is the one they name as your sin. Do you see the shape of the cage? It is not only that they take the thing from you, it is that wanting it back is itself the crime. I did not have a word for that most of my life. I have one now, and I will give it to you before we are done. At night, though, at night I would lie beside Eli and listen to him fall into the heavy breath of a tired man, and I would wait. And when the breath was deep enough, I would go down the stairs in my stocking feet with the lamp turned low, take out the notebook, and for 1/2 hour, the morning that was coming did not own me yet. I wrote nothing dramatic, the weather, the price of eggs, which child had a cough, but under all of it, every line was one woman saying, in the only place she was allowed, I am still here. I am the one writing this, not the wife, not the mother, not the minister's frau. Me, Barbara. I have to tell you about Eli, because I will not have you think he was a cruel man. He was not. He never raised his hand to me, never his voice. He loved me in the only language the Ordnung had ever given a plain man. He provided. He ordered the day. He corrected me when the church said I needed correcting, and he believed with his whole soul that headship over me was a burden God had laid on him for my good. He was tired, too. The lot had caught him around 1972. A slip of paper in a hymn book, God's hand seen in whose copy held it. And after that he stood up before the Gmai twice a month and preached a certainty I watched grow heavier on him every year. He was not the warden of my prison. He was a man in the next cell who had been told the bars were love and never once doubted it. I grieve him, and the gentler husband the church never let him learn to be, both at once. The headship doctrine is a clean thing on paper. The man is the head of the woman, as Christ is the head of the church. It sounds almost tender when the preacher says it slow, in the long, flat way the low bleed gets dragged out of the ausbund, a syllable at a time. But what it means in a kitchen over 60 years is this: there is no morning of your life that is finally yours to spend. There is always a head above you whose will runs the day, and above him a Gmai, and above the Gmai the Ordnung. that great unwritten code nobody can show you because it lives in the watching. You are never told the rule. You are only caught having broken it. I was formed by that, and then, this is the part I do not get to leave out, I formed others by it in my turn. When I became the older woman, the minister's wife, younger wives came to my kitchen in tears over marriages that asked them to disappear, and I poured the coffee and told them what had been told to me, to yield, to be demütig, that a quiet woman keeps her family together and a questioning one tears it apart. I laid the same yoke gently on their shoulders that Lydia had laid on mine, and called it helping them. I was 60 years in that fence, and for most of them I also helped hold the door. And there was my Lavina, my daughter. In 1994, the ordained men placed her under the ban. She had left an unhappy marriage and then the church, and the Meidung came down, the shunning, total, family included, no shared table, no contact, the long silence. For nearly 30 years I kept it, my own child. I turned my buggy from her on the road and went to worship the Sunday after and sang the hymns. And the whole time I told myself the silence was love, that if I held the line hard enough, she would feel the cold of it and come home. That was not love. I had a word for it, and the word was wrong. It took burying a man to find the right one. I will get to that morning. I promised, and I will. But you have to know one more woman first. My mother, Fanny. She was plain her whole life, and the first enforcer I ever knew. She taught me before I could read that a girl's worth was her yieldedness, and that a question was already a kind of pride. For most of my life, I believed she was simply what she seemed, hard, certain, closed. And then, at Lydia's funeral in 1973, she leaned to me and whispered 2 words in the old Deutsch, "Es ist vorbei," it is over. And I understood in one cold instant that she had known. All those years she watched Lydia take me across the 20 steps. She had known exactly what was being done to me and had said nothing, because saying nothing was the only mercy the women of that world knew how to give one another. She had a self somewhere too, kept hidden so deep it surfaced only once in 2 words over a grave. I think every one of those still, closed, plain women had a room in the house that was hers, and never let any of us see the door. So, the morning. Eli died at home after a long illness. I nursed him to the end. Even in his last weeks, he worried aloud whether I was keeping to the church. The Gemay was kind, the way the Gemay is kind. The men built the plain pine coffin in the barn. The women scrubbed my floors. The casseroles came to the door. We buried him near Georgetown under a small white stone, no different than every other stone in that ground. And on the third night after, my daughter-in-law slept in my spare room, because a widow should not be left alone, and I lay in the dark and did not sleep. I was not planning anything. 60 years had taught me too well not to plan. I only lay there, and somewhere in the long middle of that night, I understood a thing so simple it frightened me. There was no one's mourning to keep but my own. No man breathing in the next pillow whose day I had to rise into. The day that was coming belonged to nobody. The first time in my entire life that sentence had ever been true. Before the sun was up, I rose. I did not light the lamp upstairs. I did not want to wake the girl. I went down in my bare feet and let myself out the kitchen door and walked across the grass to the woodshed. There was frost on the ground, and I felt every blade of it. A sensible old woman would have put her shoes on, but some part of me wanted to feel the ground, to know I was the one walking, that no one had sent me. I went to the crate behind the harness Eli never mended, took out the notebook in its oilcloth, carried it back across the frozen grass to the kitchen table, and lit the lamp. And first I read it, all of it, 40 years of it, while the lamp burned and the house slept and the window slowly grayed toward a morning no one was coming to claim. Under every dull line of weather and egg prices and which child had the cough, I could hear that other voice. I am still here. I am the one writing this, going back through the decades, faithful, hidden, never once allowed up into the daylight. And I understood that the woman in those pages had been more alive in her stolen half hours after dark than the woman who lived the days had ever been allowed to be. A whole second life lived sideways, in the dark, in pencil. And I thought of Fanny, who whispered, "Es ist vorbei," over Lydia's grave, and then closed up again like a door. And I knew, the way you know a thing in your body before your mind agrees to it, that she had read pages like these too, somewhere, after my father slept. That every still and certain plain woman I had turned my buggy past in 83 years had kept something back, each of us sure she was the only one, and the keeping quiet was the very thing that made each of us alone. That morning I knew I was not, and never had been, the only one. And then I did the small thing. After everything, 60 years, a buried husband, bare feet on the frost, I opened to a clean page, picked up the pencil I had sharpened with a paring knife, and wrote at the top of it my own name. Not the wife's name, not Eli's Barbara, not the minister's Frau, not mother, not the name the Gmai knew. I wrote the name they had pinned the cap over when I was a girl. I wrote Barbara Fisher, the maiden self, the one from before. I wrote it slow, the way you write something you are not sure you are allowed to write, and I understood that it was the first word I had set down on a page in 80 years that I had not first asked someone's leave to set down. No one's will above it, no head over it, just a woman in the cold, naming herself. That is the first thing I did the morning after I buried my husband, after 60 years of obedience. I wrote down my own name. And I wept, not for grief, though the grief was real, because it had taken me 81 years and a dead man to do a thing a free child does the first day of school. There is a word for what that was, for the 60 years, the written mornings, the head above the head above the head, the silence the women kept for one another like the only gift they had. It is not a word we were allowed to use inside the fence. To say it was already pride. It took me a lifetime to say it out loud, and I am going to say it now, plainly, the way I would tell you the frost was on the grass. It was control. Not God, not faith. I still have my God. I prayed at that table the same as ever. What I had lost was the church's claim to stand between my soul and Him. The word is control, and naming it is the beginning of the end of it. I live alone now in a rented half-house on the edge of Strasbourg, a few miles from the farm where I spent 60 years. The plain people who shun me now live on the same roads. They sell at the same market where I buy my flour, and the buggies still go by, and they look the other way, and I let them. I did not run. People expect that an old woman who leaves would want to get as far from it as her legs would carry her. But there was nowhere I wanted to run to. This county is the only home I have ever had, and a woman does not have to leave it to take back her mornings. So I stay and light the lamp myself before dawn, for no one but me. That is the whole of my freedom. It is smaller than people imagine freedom to be, and the only thing I ever wanted, and I did not know its name for 80 years. I will tell you what surprised me most. It was not the loneliness. I had been lonely for 60 years inside a full house, so the empty one held no new terror. It was my own voice. The first time I heard it come back at me, an old woman's voice saying new things I had never once said aloud in 80 years of keeping a face as still as stone, I did not recognize it. That voice had been in the notebook the whole time, in pencil, after dark. It had just never been let up out of my throat. There is a particular grief in meeting yourself for the first time at 81 and knowing how little of her you have left to spend. My son Gideon shuns me now, gently, dutifully, the way I once shunned his sister, waiting for me to repent and come home. So I have it now from the inside, the cold I dealt out for 30 years. I have begun, very carefully, to reach toward Lavina again. Some of what those years took cannot be handed back, but she answers, and that is more than a woman who did what I did has any right to. The notebook still sits where I can reach it. There are new pages in it now, written in the morning, in the light, with the lamp on the table beside me, not hidden anymore, not after dark, not in fear. And every one begins with the same name at the top, Barbara Fisher. I lost her under the cap when I was a girl, and I want you to know she was in there the whole time, the whole 60 years, waiting. She did not die. She only kept very still until the morning no one was left to keep her quiet. So let me speak to you now, whoever you are out there in the dark, because I am old and I have learned this is the only part that matters. If you grew up where your mornings were written before you woke, I see you. If you ever made your whole self the size of the task in front of you, so the part that hung over the edge could not be named as your sin, I see you. If you have a name underneath the one they gave you, a name from before that you have not been allowed to write at the top of any page, I see you, and I am telling you, an old woman who waited 81 years, do not wait as long as I did. You do not need a dead man and a cold dawn to give yourself leave. You can write your own name at the top of one clean page tomorrow morning, and let that be the small thing so large you feel the ground under your bare feet. The mornings are yours. They were always supposed to be yours. The chain ends with whoever decides it ends. Let it be you.